She is lonely, overweight, and ignored by her husband. During the course of the movie, Evelyn develops a friendship with an elderly woman, Mrs. Threadgood, who lives in the nursing home. Mrs. Threadgood is a wonderful storyteller who tells Evelyn the story of two strong-willed, determined women who live in a small Alabama town in the 1930s. As the story of the young women unfold, Evelyn begins to develop a sense or a spirit of determination and independence. She discovers a hidden sense of self-confidence that she never knew she had. One afternoon, Evelyn finds herself cruising the Piggly Wiggly grocery store parking lot in search of a place to park her car. After a number of trips around the parking lot, Evelyn is overjoyed to find someone backing out of the only available parking space. But just as Evelyn begins to turn into the now empty space, two young women who are sprinting around the parking lot in a VW convertible zip into that very parking space. Dismayed, but still calm, Evelyn points out to the young women who have cut her off that she was going to take that space. Too bad, the young women snicker. Face it, lady, we're younger and faster. That did it for Evelyn. All civility disappears as her face takes on the look of a woman determined to take charge. With a gleam in her eye and a smile on her lips, Evelyn backs up her big sedan, puts the car in gear, pushes the accelerator to the floor, and smashes into the rear end of that sporty VW. 6 times, Evelyn rams the back of that little car. The two young women run from the store yelling and screaming at Evelyn. What are you doing? Are you crazy? Evelyn serenely declares to the two women, face it, girls, I'm older and I have more insurance. I remember when I first saw that scene, I was thrilled. Finally, there was justice for Evelyn, justice for all of us who have ever been cut off in a parking lot. Justice for all the times when we've had someone take advantage of us. It just felt good to see Evelyn's revenge. There's no doubt about it. Striking back feels a whole lot better than simply forgiving people for their transgressions. Vengeance is natural. Hurting those who hurt us can be exhilarating. Adrenaline kicks in and we're on top of the world, at least for a while. We get ourselves into a whole lot of trouble when we refuse to let go of our anger. Eventually, anger can turn into bitterness, and bitterness can turn us into some ugly people. Bitterness keeps us from restoring relationships, and we end up with what someone has called arthritis of the spirit. We just can't move on, no matter how hard we may try. It hurts too much to let go, and then we're stuck with ourselves, chained to hurts and wounds that begin to run our lives. Sometimes we all suffer from arthritis of the spirit of some sort, and sadly, arthritis of the spirit can make us jealous and vengeful. And as if jealousy weren't bad enough, we might just find ourselves keeping score, making sure that we come out on top, something like Evelyn did that day in the Piggly Wiggly parking lot. Acts of retaliation were part of people's lives when Jesus was around. Feelings of resentment and getting even were part of life then, just as they are now. Jesus was teaching something else. Jesus was teaching about forgiveness and reconciliation. Our friend Peter thought he understood all that, but he wanted to know what God's intentions were as far as this forgiveness business was concerned. How many times does God expect us to forgive? Peter asked, figuring that there had to be a limit. Even God must count the number of times we forgive? After all, Peter reasoned God must be keeping score. So Peter asked the question we all ask: how many times does God expect me to forgive someone who does me wrong? Don't you think 7 times is enough? The 8th time something goes wrong, I'm entitled to let them have it, right? Wrong, replied Jesus. Forgiving someone 7 times isn't nearly enough. Try 77 times, which is like saying there's no end to the number of times we're expected to forgive. Mind-boggling, isn't it? Evidently, God isn't keeping score after all, and neither should we. Now, in order to bring home his point, Jesus tells an absurd story about a servant who owes the king an unbelievable amount of money. The debt is so huge, no minimum wage earner would ever be able to pay it back. The story is absurd because it could never happen. No servant would ever be allowed to accumulate that sort of debt, and no king would ever dream of lending one of his servants such an exorbitant amount of money. By one account, the money owed was somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 billion. Anyway, the king has had it with the servant and demands to be repaid. Everybody knows that's impossible. Repayment is simply out of the question. There's no way the servant has that kind of money. It would take his lifetime, his children's lifetime, and generations beyond to pay off the debt. So the servant does the only thing he can think of. He throws himself on the mercy of the king, who in a moment of generosity forgives the debt. Now there's joy and happiness for everybody. The king feels good about himself, the servant and his family are overjoyed, not to mention relieved, and everybody lives happily ever after. But Jesus isn't finished yet. There's more. In the blink of an eye, the servant turns around and finds himself face to face with an old friend who borrowed money from him in order to buy some lunch. You owe me, brother, says the servant. You borrowed lunch money last week and haven't paid me back yet. Cough it up, or I'll have you arrested. And that could happen in those days. The friend begs for mercy. Give me some time, brother. I'll have the money for you next week. No way, exclaims the servant. Pay me now, or off you go to jail, which is it going to be? And so, the friend who owes the servant $5 is hauled off to jail, and we're left scratching our heads about the injustice of it all. But there's still more to the story. Our king gets wind of what our selfish servant has done and demands to know why the servant was so unrelenting. Don't you get it, you ungrateful jerk? I just let you off the hook for $1 billion and you can't even forgive the cost of a hamburger and french fries? Let me tell you what's going to happen to you. You're going to jail too. Off you go. You don't deserve to be forgiven. That should even the score. Hooray! Justice is done. The ungrateful servant has gotten what's coming to him, and we can all feel better about this forgiveness business. It's not so hard after all. But that's not the point Jesus is trying to make. The point is that the king is behaving just as badly as everyone else in this story. Even though at one time he thought the king was some kind of Mr. Nice Guy, an unbelievably generous fellow who goes around writing off massive debts. By the end of the story, the king is the sort of person who repays injustice with punishment. The servant he wanted to put in jail at the beginning of the story ends up being turned over to torturers by the end. The king does to the ungrateful servant what the ungrateful servant did to his friend. There really is no difference between the angry king who punished for debt and the angry servant who punished for debt. Neither one of these people understood forgiveness at all. They just wanted to keep score. The servant didn't recognize the gift of forgiveness. He rejoiced, not because he was forgiven, but because he got away with it. He thought he had outsmarted And as for the king, forgiveness wasn't on his mind either. Wiping out the servant's debt was a matter of power, not reconciliation. The king's gift of generosity was only so good, as long as the servant did what the king expected him to do. True, for both the king and the servant, keeping score mattered more than anything else. Once upon a time, there was a stranger who came into a small town one day and stood in the center of the town square. He was wearing a very strange coat. It was black, and sewn onto it were patches of cloth of all sizes, shapes, and colors. As word spread of this strange visitor, the townspeople gathered in curious silence. Finally, a brave soul dared to ask about the significance of the unique coat. The stranger immediately began to point out different patches and explained that they represented the sins of the people who were living in the town. Embarrassed, some people left the square indignant, others shook their heads in denial of the accusations. After explaining every patch and denouncing every sin, the man turned around and headed out of town. On his back was a dark patch of cloth that covered almost his entire coat. The townspeople wondered out loud what and whose sin that patch represented. Suddenly a voice rang out loud and clear, "That represents his own sin, for he is willing to point out the shortcomings of others, yet fails to see his own." The members of the young church in Rome were engaged in keeping score, and they were more than happy to point out other people's sins and shortcomings. Needless to say, our friend Paul wasn't at all pleased with this finger-pointing group. You see, a lot of the scorekeeping had to do with who was considered part of the in-group part versus those who were seen as outsiders. Most of the arguing involved doctrine and religious practices. The big question was all about, if you can believe this, eating meat which had been sacrificed to other idols and gods. Bickering's been going on in the Christian church forever. There were some members of the Roman congregation who felt that anyone who ate that sort of tainted meat was committing blasphemy. These folks felt the safest course was to only eat vegetables, since it was hard to know where each piece of meat came from. On the other hand, there were those who were convinced that since those other idols and statues were just stone and wood because there's only one God, nothing could really happen to the meat, and so it was perfectly acceptable to eat it. We can almost hear the frustration in Paul's voice as he tries very emphatically to let this fractured congregation know that God could care less about whether or not people eat meat. That's not the point, Paul says, getting yourselves all tangled up in all sorts of arguments over over meat, or who lights the candles for worship, or who collects the offering, or what we're going to eat for dinner after worship isn't what following Christ is all about. Get over yourselves, Paul declares. Don't you know that God welcomes everyone unconditionally? God is not keeping score about all these details. There is no group, and there is no in-group, and there are no outsiders in God's realm. We are all equal in the eyes of God. Strength of faith isn't determined by how much Bible reading we do or how many scripture verses we could quote. Forget about being a know-it-all when it comes to our Christian faith community. Stop trying to throw your weight around, Paul declares. And just in case you don't get it, here's the thing. Pointing out everyone else's shortcomings won't get you anywhere. Paul tells the congregation in Rome and us to get off our high horses and open our arms and hearts to everyone who comes our way. Both Paul and Jesus are trying to teach us that keeping score, judging one another, and holding grudges are not the way we, as children of God, are supposed to behave. Indeed, the point of Jesus' absurd little story is the true forgiveness and reconciliation come from the heart. Forgiveness is about our desire to restore relationships with those who may have hurt us, or those whom we have hurt. Forgiveness is an act of courage. It's an act of love. Forgiveness doesn't come naturally. We have to work at it. Forgiveness requires a lot of practice and patience. But forgiveness also sets us free. Forgiving frees us from the ugliness of resentment and bitterness. And practicing forgiveness does something else too. It enables us to recognize that we have been forgiven over and over and over. God's overwhelming gift of love and grace keeps wiping the slate clean, even as we continue to pile up the debts. We will never know how many times God's forgiving love has been poured out on us. Last week we talked about how Christ's desire for us is to be one community in faith, without any judgment, finger-pointing, or scorekeeping. We should always be striving to build a strong faith community based on love and acceptance of all people. So as we think about all this today, let's remember that in Paul's letter to the church in Rome, he was encouraging everyone in the congregation to keep their eyes on what's truly important: faithfulness, thanksgiving to God, and leaving judgment to God. With this view in mind, Paul was pointing out that there are many different ways of following Jesus. Our issues may be different today, but Paul's process still has a lot to recommend to us if we just pay attention. So I'm going to ask you now to join together as we read Meditation on Community Life that's based on the scripture from Romans. I will read the leader part. Let me make sure I get this right. Carol, you're going to do the right side. You folks over here are the right side, and I'll meet you on the left side. You got it?
Got it.
Welcome those who differ, but not for the purpose of quarreling over opinions. Some believe in eating anything.
Others eat only vegetables.
Those who eat must not despise those who abstain.